I'm live, Calix Boxing 2.0 here with Dragon Style, D-Style Boxing. And if you're coming in, make sure you hit that like button.
Yeah.
All that good stuff. And if you're catching us in the archives, we want a lot of comments on this one. In the comments section below, leave your comments on how you think this all plays out. Leave the comments. We get to them. We like them. We respond to them. So hit us up in that comment section. But first and foremost, if you're catching us live, make sure to leave a comment and hit that like button. So we're doing Days of Futures Past. Last week, what was it? De La Hoya versus Trinidad. This week, we're talking Pacquiao. And it's an important one because Pacquiao versus De La Hoya was such an important fight in Pacquiao's career and how it went from there on. De La Hoya introduced Mayweather and Pacquiao to a level of stardom that they did not have before. So De La Hoya was important, especially late on in his career, introducing Mayweather and Pacquiao to a bigger market, a much bigger market than they were accustomed to. So what if the fight didn't happen? So explain to us, once again, Days of Futures Past. What's the concept?
Well,
let us all know these now.
Well, before anything, just to piggyback off what you're saying, right? Keep in mind that this was a fight that at first was seen as like a joke. Like people were like, yeah, whatever. Like it was talked about a little bit. It was hinted at. You know, both sides, De La Hoya and Pacquiao kind of laughed at it at first. And then Pacquiao started saying, is he serious? Or like, you know, they kind of just threw it out there. Like, I mean, if he wants to fight me, you know what I mean? I got nothing to lose. Shit, I'll go up there and fight him. And shortly enough, the fight happened, and we all know it was a bridge. That fight opened a Pandora's box. It opened the whole new element. And to be honest with you, it gave it, like Pacquiao himself gave life to the sport of boxing, right? He proved that boxing could create new stars. At least he was already huge in the Philippines and in Latin America, but as far in the U.S., he was relatively known, but he became even bigger. He became a superstar. So if the fight didn't happen, let's say Pacquiao never said, are you serious about that? Or let's say he just laughed at it, like whatever, you know.
And it's important to point out how this originated. The genesis of it was Larry Merchant after one of the fights saying, what if this mythical matchup, this mega fight between De La Hoya and Pacquiao, a guy coming up from the lower weight classes, fighting at 135 now, moved up to 147 and fought Oscar De La Hoya. That was the genesis of all of this. And you got to give Larry Merchant credit because he gave birth to this great fight. Well, not a great fight, great performance, but a performance that catapulted Manny Pacquiao into, this was Pacquiao mania. No. This turned from Pacquiao to Pacquiao mania.
Absolutely. So now, after the David Diaz fight, which is where we would kind of start this, right? Keep in mind, guys, the fight in this scenario, the fight doesn't happen. There's no De La Hoya versus Pacquiao. So we want to talk about the immediate aftermath of that, how it impacted both guys, because De La Hoya's in the mix too. Like, well, how's De La Hoya's outlook look? How does Pacquiao's look? In the immediate, and then we'll talk the long-term careers and effects, because we like to not just go with the micro, but the macro. How does it affect the sport as a whole, right? Where are we now? You know, if anything. So first, after the you know, because if you remember the Celtics, who I believe were the reigning NBA champions at the time, I could be mistaken about that. I believe they were, right? They show up to the locker room, they're chanting Manny, Manny. Like they were huge Manny Pacquiao fans, and so Manny was known as at least athletes knew about Manny, at least, right? The hardcore boxing fans knew about Manny Pacquiao, and a fight that was big. And I believe the fight that would have happened would have been I don't know, it's not as big as De La Hoya Pacquiao. It's not going to do 1 million buys, ladies and gentlemen. But I think it would have been a solid 350,000 buys. Like it would have been like one of those, like the little guys, you know, selling solid. I think the immediate aftermath of that would have been the fight everybody that was clamoring to see. And it's a fight we missed by this much. And it was Manny Pacquiao versus Edwin Valero. I do believe that's a fight that would have happened. Edwin Valero had he was working with Top Rank. He got permission to start fighting in the U.S. is one of the big reasons why he wasn't allowed to fight, or not allowed, but it was one of the holdups when making the Manny Pacquiao fight. You know what I mean? And that's the fight that would have happened. Instead of Valero winning the vacant belt, defending it twice, then like destroying DeMarco, which I thought was a great performance. And then we all know what happened with Valero, right? But I think the Manny Pacquiao Edwin Valero fight happens. I think it's a fight of the year candidate. And I think Manny Pacquiao wins that fight. There's some people that don't agree with me with that. I think there's some people that believe the Venezuelan would have won, but I disagree. I think Manny Pacquiao wins that fight. I think he wins in a competitive but clear victory. I think he stops Valero late. I think it's a great performance for him. And then, of course, that fight he would still be competing with quote unquote Golden Boy, but it would have been with Golden Boy's fighter, Juan Manuel Marquez. I think Marquez was right. Marquez was stalking this dude. Like, no matter what scenario you change in Manny Pacquiao's career, this dude, Marquez shows up. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he's there. Doesn't matter what you change.
It's like Golovkin Canelo, right?
Yeah. Like in Avengers, like no matter what scenario, Thanos is still there. In some capacity, like Marquez is still there. That trilogy happens. I think it's just as controversial. Manny probably gets a decision, but it's controversial as fuck. And then I think Manny Pacquiao goes on to unify. I don't know if he becomes undisputed, but I think he unifies. I think he fights the other I think a Juan Diaz fight is possible. Okay, because maybe Juan Diaz doesn't fight Marquez. I think he destroys Juan Diaz. I think he has a solid resume in a historic division, lightweight instead of welterweight. He stays because he's a little dude, bro. I don't think people realize that Manny Pacquiao was never supposed to be fighting welterweight at that point. I'll stop there because we'll just cover the immediate aftermath.
The first fight Pacquiao ever fought, I believe he weighed 106. So this is a dude who's essentially at minimum weight. He's a dude who essentially fought in 11, 12 weight classes. So it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, but I think he has a historic run and still has that controversial fight with Juan Manuel Marquez. Like, I still think
there's no doubt he would have fought Marquez 4 times regardless. There's just no doubt.
So that's my immediate. That's my immediate aftermath.
Right. So here's my immediate. So he doesn't fight. Let's say the fight between Pacquiao versus De La Hoya never materializes. Pacquiao destroys David Diaz. Remember David Diaz's famous post-fight interview is, I thought he had a knife in there. I thought Freddie was in there with him, stabbing me. So David Diaz had no idea what was hitting him. Pacquiao was in full Pacquiao mode.
Motherfucker's fast. I remember said that.
Yeah. So here's where we would, I don't know. Here's where we would differ, right? I think the Hatton fight still happens shortly after. Yeah. I don't think he sticks around at 135. Now, the Valero thing is interesting to me. It's intriguing, but I pulled up the ring rankings around this time at 135. Nate Campbell, Juan Diaz, Julio Diaz, Joel Casamayor, and Michael Katsidis. I don't know if there's enough there to keep Pacquiao interested. I think the goal at that point, remember, when Pacquiao versus De La Hoya was mentioned, Freddie Roach started to salivate. He's like, I would love to move this smaller dude with all his hand speed and this power that he can
train him against Mayweather. He knew some.
Yeah, right. Up into the higher weight classes. So that's why I don't think he was going to stick around at 135. I don't think 135 was ever a long-term plan for Pacquiao and his team. I think it was going to be a bridge division. They were going to test the waters there and then move up and then test the waters at 140. I agree with you, and we'll talk about the long term after this. But in the short term, I don't think 135 was a play. I think 140 would have been the play. Remember, Ricky Hatton was there. Freddie Roach loved that matchup. And as you said, Freddie Roach loved a lot of matchups that ended up not being so good matchups for Pacquiao. But I just think that the Ricky Hatton fight would have happened around the same time that it happened. Maybe even a little before. Had De La Hoya not been the play, Ricky Hatton would have been the play at 140 instead of De La Hoya. So here's what I think happens. He doesn't fight De La Hoya. There's one more fight at 135. Perhaps a Nate Campbell, perhaps a Juan Diaz, or perhaps Edwin Valero. You're right. Top rank, that fight could have happened. Perhaps it's the Valero fight. And after the Valero fight, I think they go right back up to where they would have been around the same time. And that's 140 and Ricky Hatton. And I remember that night like it was yesterday. I had casual fans because back then, I wasn't on Twitter. I wasn't on YouTube, none of that stuff. But people knew me from Facebook talking about boxing. And anytime a big event happened, the casuals would hit me up on, my casual friends would hit me up on Facebook. They were going crazy over Pacquiao after he knocked out Ricky Hatton. They were saying that there's no way Mayweather beats Pacquiao. Pacquiao is a beast, all this good stuff. So that was sort of like Pacquiao mania right there. When he knocked out Ricky Hatton, like that seemed to me to be like, if not the height of it, close to it. Right?
It's an underrated win for sure.
But I'll say this, like what linked, and we'll get to this when we talk longer term, but what linked Mayweather and Pacquiao together a lot was the De La Hoya fight. Mm-hmm. They both shared the De La Hoya fight. People were comparing and contrasting the two fights. De La Hoya introduced them both into a bigger market, and he introduced Pacquiao to 147. So let's go from there to long term. What happens to Pacquiao? Yeah,
go ahead. Before we go to long term, I want to touch on what De La Hoya would have done, because I think it's important that De La Hoya only went back down, like because people will say, "Oh, he went back down to fight Pacquiao," but that's not necessarily true. If those remember, he did a catch weight. I believe it was 150 against Stevie Forbes, because he was trying to do the rematch with Mayweather 147.
That was at the Home Depot Center. I remember it.
Yeah. So people always like
on regular HBO.
People forget that. People always say, "Oh, Manny Pacquiao made a move down." Like that's not even true, bro. Like he was going to go down to 147. He had plans.
You remember that fight, by the way? Do you remember Stevie Forbes having?
Yeah,
he was touching Oscar up a little bit.
Yeah, he was. Oscar had some black eyes. Oscar wanted to fight, but he had some problems. Mm-hmm. But obviously, Mayweather ended up retiring. I don't know why. I mean, Mayweather would have easily beat him at 147, but he retired, right? Whatever. And De La Hoya needed an opponent. Pacquiao steps up. They do that fight. That's how that fight happened, just for the record. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like, oh, De La Hoya, he's over here minding his own business at 154. Then Pacquiao, like, pulled him down. And no, that's not what happened. I just want to make sure people understand that. Mm-hmm. If you remember, he was already talking about, oh, I'll fight the winner of Cotto versus Margarito. And then when Margarito won, I don't know, for whatever reason, he wasn't interested in that one. But maybe he felt the Cotto fight would have been a bigger fight. Whatever the reason is, right?
They wanted to do De La Hoya versus Cotto bad.
I believe, that's what I believe would have happened. I think if there's no De La Hoya, if there's no Pacquiao option, like if that's not a thing, I think he settles for a fight with Margarito. Margarito had fought at 154 before. Mm-hmm. I think he A-sides Margarito and they fight.
You're talking about De La Hoya, right?
De La Hoya, I'm sorry, yes, De La Hoya. I think De La Hoya fights Margarito. I think they fight at 154 or at a catch weight of some sort. Maybe tries to stay close to 147 just in case or something. I think De La Hoya has, like, instead of Mosley being the guy that did that to Margarito, it would have been De La Hoya. I think De La Hoya destroys. De La Hoya destroys Antonio Margarito, annihilates him. Really? If they fight anywhere 150 and above, I believe that 100%. Dude, think about this. How is he going to stop that left hook from landing? And can anybody take that left hook? Just think about that. But let me say this. That's what I believe happens. He beats Margarito, and then he has the trilogy with Shane Mosley because Shane Mosley isn't there to do the fight with Margarito. I think he wins the trilogy with Mosley, right? But let me backtrack a little bit. Vernon Forrest was calling now De La Hoya. Now, this would have to happen before Vernon Forrest unfortunately gets shot because he's running after the dude to try to, like, I don't want, like,
in Atlanta. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but please don't run after dudes that just robbed you. Like, it is what it is. But what I'm saying is, I think it would have to fit, but I think he beats Margarito. I think he has that fight with Forrest. I still think to this day, De La Hoya anywhere at 154 beats Forrest. He has a trilogy with Mosley. He avenges that. And then eventually he loses a rematch with Mayweather. Eventually they rematch. Mayweather, because Mayweather comes back. The Marcus fight will not happen. Because Marcus only went up because he was chasing Pacquiao. That's the only reason he even fought Mayweather. Because he wanted to do something in that weight class, right? So I think, and that's the end of De La Hoya. Mayweather beats him in the rematch, and that's it there's no long term for De La Hoya. It ends right there. That's what I believe happened. I don't know what you think for De La Hoya, but that's how I see it.
I don't know where to go from that. I don't think that Mosley loses to De La Hoya, by the way.
With their fight?
No, I mean, excuse me. I don't think Margarito loses to De La Hoya.
Okay, so maybe it ends there.
I think it's a completely different stylistic matchup. I don't think that De La Hoya would have been able to consistently throughout the fight sit on his punches the way that Mosley did in that fight. Mosley fought a perfect.
Well, before I even get there, do you even think he would have fought Margarito? Like, what do you think would happen?
Yeah, because De La Hoya was looking for another fight, right? He didn't want to end it that way. The Stevie Forbes fight, yeah, all that, but they wanted to make the De La Hoya Cotto fight badly, and people forget that. And then Margarito ruined that. So I tend to agree with you. I think Margarito would have been the play for De La Hoya in that fight. Possibly he beats him, possibly not. And then it depends on if he wins that fight going forward, if the Mosley fight happens and all that good stuff after. But in the Mayweather rematch. But they wanted to make that Cotto fight bad, and Margarito ruined those plans. So, I just think that Oscar's career would have ended in that next fight, regardless. I just think he was washed up. I don't think he had.
You might have a point though, because that's when he was coked up and taking pictures of pantyhose. And
remember leading up to the Pacquiao fight, he drained himself all the way down to 147 a couple weeks before the fight. It just wasn't smart, and I think he came in a couple pounds under 140.
Yeah, but I think he did that for Pacquiao because Pacquiao was coming up for 135. Mm-hmm. But he wouldn't have done that for Margarito. Like, he would have fought Margarito 152, 154. That's what I believe. He would have made him come up, bro.
So maybe Oscar was completely weight drained in that fight. Perhaps he wasn't.
Maybe not. But what I'm saying is, I think he beats that's how I feel. I just think he beats Margarito.
Yeah, possibly. But as far as Pacquiao goes, let's talk 147. If he doesn't fight De La Hoya, does he ever end up at 147? I know you have a theory on this, so speak on it. Where do you think he goes long term?
So I already said, I believe he has a run in 135. We disagree there. I think he has a run in 135. 135 is a historic division. I think the only reason he moved on was because that De La Hoya fight was there. 135 historically is not a division guys just like to skip.
But there was no bigger fight at 135 than Ricky Hatton at 140.
Maybe while there was a Valero fight. And I think
still, Ricky Hatton was a bigger fight than that
would have been watering for that Valero fight. They wanted that fight bad. They wanted that fight really bad. So I think the Valero fight was there. I think a trilogy with Marcus was there. I think that fight would have happened. I think he would have eventually moved up to 147. And I do agree with you. I think he now whether Hopkins is whether Hatton's still around or not, I don't know. But he would have picked up a belt to. I do think Hatton would have still been around. I think he beats Hatton. I think he ends up fighting Bradley just like he did, but at 140. I think that fight happens. I think a lot of things changed, bro. Because I think he probably fights Peterson at 140 because he was around, and I think I think it caps at 140. I think Pacquiao doesn't go to 147 till the very end of his career just to grab another trinket.
That's what you're thinking happens?
That's what I believe, yes.
So the rankings at 140 at the time were Ricky Hatton, obviously,
right.
Junior Witter, Timothy Bradley.
Bradley would have been Witter still, and he would still fight Bradley.
Malignaggi, Holt, and Urango.
Does he fight Malignaggi? That Malignaggi fight probably happens, and I think he fucks him up.
Malignaggi would have definitely been in the mix for a fight. He would have talked his way into a fight if Pacquiao stayed at 140.
Hatton would have still beaten Malignaggi in this hypothetical. You know what I mean?
What's that?
Like he would have still beaten Malignaggi.
Hatton?
So a guy that we're forgetting, like there's some things we're forgetting about. I think the Broner fight happens earlier than we thought. In the real life scenario, he eventually fought Broner, but in this Days of Futures Past scenario, where Manny Pacquiao's in the mix at 135, he's in the mix at 140. I think the Broner fight happens earlier too. I think a Maidana fight happens too.
Yeah.
I think he stays at 140 for a while. You know what I mean?
140 for a while. I agree with you there. But 147 definitely happens. The reason I say 147 happens is the boxing gods, things happen for a reason. And I don't think a guy who has 18 fights at 147 just doesn't ever fight at 147 just because Oscar De La Hoya doesn't introduce him to 147. You know? Eventually he ends up there. Eventually he has a great run.
I think you're underestimating how ridiculous the notion of Pacquiao fighting 147 was.
No, I remember it. I remember it clearly.
And I think he eventually gets there, but I don't think it's anywhere near as fast. I just don't. Everything sped up as soon as he fought De La Hoya. Everything. You know what I mean? Like everything just sped up. I think I still remember, shout out to Russ Abner. He was doing a show and somebody asked, Pacquiao or Mayweather, who would win? And this was when Pacquiao was at 130, right? And it was already like his fourth or fifth weight class, or as champion anyway. And Mayweather was at 147. And I remember he answered the question and he said, guys, this is ridiculous. Like, this is like Superman versus like Mighty Mouse. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's like it's like a ridiculous question to even suggest.
You remember who the first person is who brought up Mayweather versus Pacquiao? Like, what is we talked about the genesis of Pacquiao versus De La Hoya. It was Larry Merchant. You remember who the first person is who brought up that fight?
I think it's impossible to know because they were both number one, number two, pound for pound.
It just naturally happened, right?
And so it was already being talked about in terms of pound for pound. You know what I mean? It wasn't talked about like head to head. Mm-hmm. It was a discussion about pound for pound. Like who's the better fighter
in the same division.
Yeah, and they were nowhere near the same division. Like Pacquiao was like campaigning 126 and Mayweather was at 147 when that started.
So this is an interesting aspect of this too, is how long would it have been before people started calling for Mayweather versus Pacquiao had Pacquiao not fought De La Hoya? That's another interesting thing. And for me, I think it would have been if he knocked out Ricky Hatton the way I think he would have around the same time. I think that's when it starts. They're only a division apart, and they have a shared.
Yeah, but it's a jump, bro. 140, 147, such a big jump. Like it just is. And I just don't know if it happens that fast. I think, like I said, eventually he fights there. He picks up a trinket. Maybe he does fight Thurman around the same time when Thurman was champion and beats him or something. You know what I mean? The perception of Pacquiao beating a reigning champion Thurman would be so different if that was his first fight at 147 and then he retires. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But I just don't think we see the 147 run. I think he has a fight or two, but it's not a run. I just don't. I think he stays at 135. I think he was perfectly acclimated at 135. This guy was a lightweight fighting welterweight. He just was for a long time. You know what I mean? And I think he would have had a run at 135. 140. I think he would have been there for a long time, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just to refresh people's memories who don't have box rec in front of them, this is the story. He was at 126 in 2004, and he fought Oscar at 147 4 years later in 2008. Just think of a huge jump. Like, just think of a fighter, pick a fighter at 126 right now, and think of him at welterweight 4 years from now. Furthermore, think of a guy who started his career at 106.
You have to put some perspective in it for sure. Because I think people get
at 150. But that's what happened here. And then he weighed in at 142 for the De La Hoya fight. This is right after the David Diaz fight. Jumps up 2 weight classes to fight De La Hoya. Weighs in at 142. The next fight, he fights Ricky Hatton at 140. Then he fights Miguel Cotto at 147. Then he starts going on his welterweight run. It's Miguel Cotto, Josh Clottey. Then he goes up and fights Antonio Margarito at a 150-pound catchweight. Now, remember this. This was only Margarito's second fight at 154. It was for a vacant belt at 154 at a catchweight. So, just keep that stuff in mind. And it was for a vacant belt, for the WBC vacant belt. And Pacquiao weighed 144.5, fighting for the junior middleweight belt. Then he fought Mosley. Then he fought Marquez a third time. Then he fought Bradley. Then he fought Marquez a fourth time. Then he fought Rios, Bradley a second time, Algieri, Mayweather, Bradley a third time, Vargas, Horn, Batiste, Broner, Thurman, Ugas. That's 18.
Look at all those names you mentioned. A lot of those fights could have been made at 140. A lot of them.
True.
Like I think Pacquiao reigns
Bradley for sure.
I think Pacquiao reigns as the king of 135. I do think, though, and it would have been, I believe, at 140 that Marcus fight still happens. And if the scenarios are identical, I think Marcus probably knocks him out. He doesn't escape the wrath. Like, no matter what you change in Pacquiao, unless you change like the birth of Marquez, unless you change that, this dude is still like. Do you agree that he's still there, regardless of the scenarios? Right? Marquez is still there, no matter what meta universe he goes to, no matter where he goes, no matter what scenario changes. Juan Manuel Marquez is still chasing this dude down.
That happens 4 times regardless of anything. Some things you can't get in the way of, no matter what happens, and you can't get in the way of those 4 fights. So I want to throw this by you too. Yeah. You know what the welterweight rankings were when Pacquiao stepped up to 147 for the first time? It was Margarito 1, Cotto 2, Mosley 3, Clottey 4, and De La Hoya was in the top 10 as well. I believe he was like 6. And then we're not counting Mayweather, who was officially retired, so not in the rankings. So he would have been considered 1. So he fights 6 of the 7 top guys. He goes on to fight in the welterweight rankings. It's crazy.
I don't know how is De La Hoya ranked? He hadn't fought like in 7 years of welterweight, but that's but I guess it's there. You know what I mean?
Right.
Look, I think that 4th fight with Marcus still happens. I think Thurman and the Porters of the world, that they still end up where they end up. And I think Pacquiao ends up fighting like a Thurman or somebody, getting a big win, winning it would have been his 7th world title. I think, forget about 8. I don't think he ever fights at the next weight class. But
I don't think I agree with you there. I don't think he goes up.
Yeah, but I don't think the Mayweather fight happens. If the fight barely happened when they were both hot and we had to wait 5-6 years for it, I don't think the fight happens. If Pacquiao's running, in my scenario where he's at 135, 140 for a while, it doesn't happen.
So you think if he doesn't fight De La Hoya, if that fight doesn't happen, the Mayweather fight never happens either?
I think for a long time people don't even entertain that fight, to be honest.
What do you think Pacquiao's overall impact on boxing is if the De La Hoya fight never happens? Is he ever the mega star?
He might not be the mega star, like he might not be the mega of mega stars. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But he's still a star. Like again, like the Celtics were showing up to his fights. Um, is he selling like a million buys or close to that? No, but he's still a star. I think. I think his resume is comparable to what he actually accomplished. I believe that. The
Yeah.
Valero win, he still
I guess
fights
what I'm asking
Marquez.
is he the casual star that he becomes? And it's hard to imagine if
Probably
he
not.
can become that without De La Hoya as the A side
Yeah, he
in that
doesn't
fight.
have the torch. There's no torch. Like, you know what I mean?
And
Like,
people need to remember that Pacquiao and Mayweather fed off of each other. Part
yeah.
of their allure, their appeal, was they were
But
connected
I'll be
to each
honest.
other
But
constantly.
I'll be honest with you though. Like, I think boxing's in a better place right now. If Pacquiao Mayweather's never a thing, if they never fight, boxing's in a better place. Like, I don't think. First of all, I think that fight itself hurt boxing. It was not an
Yeah,
entertaining fight.
there's
It
no
turned
doubt.
off a lot of people. That's number
There's
one.
no doubt.
Second, I think Pacquiao's in more entertaining fights, and it helps elevate the sport a little more. Maybe not to the casual, but I think there's more hardcores,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's no like again them feeding off of each other. So if Mayweather comes back, I think he fights better opposition overall, and I think Pacquiao has his run. 135, 140. If they do fight, it's down the line again. But hey, it is what it is.
But how many things over under 5 fights at welterweight for Pacquiao
Mm-hmm.
if he doesn't fight De La Hoya? Over under.
Yeah.
What are you taking? Because he's at 18. He has had 18 welterweight fights. 18, D style.
He only has like 4 or 5 at the most under my scenario.
Really?
Yeah, like I look, dude. Everything changes without the Deloya fight. A lot of things change. Again, the thought of him going to 147 was ridiculous. Like it wasn't. It's like saying Lomachenko going to 147 right now, bro.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, well, what if Lomachenko goes up there and fights Crawford? Like, people will laugh at you. Like what are we talking about? You know what I mean? That's like whether people want to acknowledge that that's how it sounded talking about Pacquiao going to 147.
So let's imagine real quick Lomachenko goes to 140 and batters, let's throw out a name. Let's say Ricky Hatton was number 1 at 140 at the time. So let's say Josh Taylor. Let's say he batters. Lomachenko moves up at 140 and batters Josh Taylor. Just absolutely
That's an
batters.
impressive win. That's great. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, are there talks of 147 at that point?
No.
Probably
No,
not,
because
right?
nobody even believes that like Josh Taylor could fuck with those dudes. So like what I'm saying is a whole new like dimension opened. Like a Pandora's box was open
When
the
he fought
moment, and I would like, what do you guys think? I mean, we're talking the scenario. Let's talk the scenarios, guys. You know what I mean? Like I think because I was there, I was a boxing fan then, and I know what the feeling was about just the thought. Like, if you said Pacquiao should go to 147 and fight, like you were called a casual, bro. Like you were just like, what are you talking about? It's like that Rose dude talking about Lomachenko fighting Canelo. Like it's like that's what it sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
And he was all you got to do. Look at the odds. Even though everyone knew De La Hoya hadn't fought, he didn't look good against Forbes, and then he was dropping down another 3 pounds, and he was still a big favorite. Like I'm just saying, like I think
De La Hoya was a big favorite against Pacquiao.
He was a big favorite. Like I'm just saying. So all I'm saying is, and all what this is about perspective, right? I think since we now know he was good enough to compete at 147, we know that, right? I think eventually he moves up and he wins a belt at 147, right? But I think he has like 3 or 4 fights at the most, to be honest with you.
3 or 4 at the most. Here's where I disagree with you. And I
It's like
say
De La Hoya.
over.
How many middleweight fights did he have? 2.
Yeah. But here's the thing. When we talk about Pacquiao, when did he retire?
Just recently.
Last year, right? Just retired last year. So he would have had a long career still. He would have
Maybe.
stuck around. His body would have at least eventually got him to 147. And I think he would have had more fights at 147 than you think. The question is at what point, because it matters, right? Matters because I just mentioned the guys that were in the top of the rankings at that time. Margarito, he fought him at 154, I understand, but Margarito, Cotto, Mosley, he fought Cotto right off the bat after the De La Hoya fight. Sent Cotto packing up to 154. Mosley, Clottey, does he end up fighting those guys at 147, or is he at 140 handling business at that point? Does he go back down to 135? And then we get a totally different historical picture of Pacquiao at the welterweight division.
You know what? I think Pacquiao Broner would sell very well. Like an undefeated Broner, like on the come up, 140 pounds. It's like a poor man's version of the Mayweather fight. But I think it would sell. I think that fight. Look, it sold like 400,000 when Broner had multiple losses and Pacquiao was considered past his prime. Imagine what it would have done if Pacquiao was a man at 140 and Broner is on the come up and he's at 140 pounds. Think about that. So I think he has a lot of.
Either way, we're looking at a historical run and a guy who is probably somehow breaks out into the casual market. Maybe not as big. No, definitely not as big had he fought De La Hoya and had he been attached to Mayweather sooner. Because eventually he's tied to Mayweather as well. They're both top pound for pound, number one, number two, and they would have been a weight class away from each other. So then the talks would have started, let's do that at a catch weight. Why can't these guys fight at a catch weight? Then another hurdle in the fight maybe never happens, or maybe it does. Maybe it happens around the same time. I don't know. But I just tend to think that a dude who had this type of run at welterweight over 18 fights, eventually he would have found his way up there to have a great run in the same weight class. I can't imagine one fight has that much of an impact. I know it could, but it's hard to believe that the boxing gods would allow a dude who had an 18 fight run in the welterweight division over a decade would never fight in that division had he not got a single fight. It's hard to believe. It's just hard for me to believe that.
Does he move up at 147? Like if he never fought at 147 and Marcus knocks him out, does he go to 147? I don't think he does. And if he does, it's only for a couple fights.
When was that fourth fight? That was
but everything changes though. Like that third fight and that fourth, like the timeline changes completely. It's like a deck of cards. Like and you play blackjack, everything changes. No matter, like it's still the same players, but everything changes if a guy says hit me too many times. You know what I mean? Like the whole deck changes. The deck changes completely. I think the third fight happens faster, and then I think the fourth fight eventually happens. But I think if it happens before 2012, in my opinion, you know what I mean. And I think Pacquiao proved he was a great fighter. He would overcome all that, right? But it. I think down the line he has that last run at 147. He wins a belt, a trinket at 147, then he rides it to a sunset, in my opinion.
Yeah, and if he never fights Mayweather, he never has that loss. I think the one thing we both agree on is the junior middleweight fight. That belt never happens.
Never happens.
I agree with that. I don't think he ever finds his way up there. He possibly still fights Margarito, but not at junior middleweight. But that's one fight though at welterweight that had the De La Hoya fight never happened. I think that's one fight I really think doesn't happen at welterweight because Margarito was such a big, an imposing welterweight, right?
Yeah.
So it's just hard to imagine that fight happens at the
Where's
Cotto.
Mosley in the mix? Like, where's he fit in the mix? Because like, in my scenario, that Mosley Margarito fight never happens because De La Hoya gets the fight. Maybe he beats De La Hoya and then Mosley fights him. Who knows, right? Like this, I guess it could happen. But and Golden Boy and Top Rank were working together at the time. It's important for people to note that. But where's Mosley in all this? I think he's kind of like, in my scenario, he loses the trilogy to De La Hoya, but I don't know where you have Mosley.
Well, possibly he's one of the first welterweight fights for Pacquiao if he moves up. Because I just think if he moves up to 147, it's not Cotto first. It's not. They're not going to do that fight first. They're not going to have a guy who's closer to his prime in the first move up to 147. It would be a guy with a name who is well past his prime. And Shane Mosley fits that description.
You know what else, though? Something to think about. Mosley was saying he'd be willing to drop down to like 142, 143 to fight Pacquiao.
Mm-hmm.
This is before the Mayweather fight. He was saying that. He was saying that. So does Mosley move down? Do we have a catchweight fight before he moves up to 147? Does Mosley fight him in a catchweight fight?
Here's what I think happens. I'm gonna just go on a limb here.
Sure.
He destroys Ricky Hatton still after fighting possibly Valero. He has another fight at 135 after the David Diaz fight. Then he moves up, fights Ricky Hatton at 140. I still think that fight happens because it's the biggest fight in and around 135. It's right there at 140, neighboring division. I think Freddie steps him up. He destroys Ricky Hatton in the same fashion. I don't think the Cotto fight happens. I don't think the Clottey fight happens. So in place of those two fights, I don't think the Margarito fight happens. So that's 3 straight fights at welterweight right after the Hatton fight. So I think what happens instead is he stays at 140, fights guys like Malignaggi. The Malignaggi fight would have definitely happened. It would have definitely happened at 140. Malignaggi would have talked his way into the fight, and it would have happened. Possibly some cross-promotion issues, but I just think the fight would have happened at 140. It's an easy fight stylistically for Pacquiao. Pacquiao sends him to hell in a handbasket. Possibly a Peterson, possibly a Holt, somebody like that. But you know the fight that happens, actually, it's probably Bradley gets the Pacquiao shot earlier. That's probably what happens here. Bradley gets the Pacquiao shot, and he gets it at 140 instead of 147. He gets it much earlier than he got it, and he gets it at 140. I think that's what happens. And then eventually they start to test the waters at 147, possibly a catch weight with Shane Mosley, and that's his introduction into 147. But eventually it's going to be a guy at 147, and I think it's around that time, around the time where he originally fought Mosley, possibly at a catch weight, and then that's when he picks up 147. Actually, the Marquez fight, the third one, happened after the first, after the Mosley fight. So he probably goes back down to 140 and fights Marquez, right? In the third fight. And then possibly we get a Bradley rematch. Possibly we get the fourth fight with Marquez. And you know what? Now that I think about it, now that I piece it together, if Marquez knocks him out in that fourth fight at 140, you might be right. Like they might not go up to 147 anytime soon. You might be right. You might be right, because we're all the way down to when he fought Rios after the fourth Marquez fight.
Yep.
He fights Brandon Rios at 140, right? He likely fights Brandon Rios at 140. Then we're at the second Bradley fight. The second Bradley fight happens at 140. The Algieri fight, that could happen at 140.
Yep.
And then the Mayweather fight likely doesn't happen.
I think he fights Pervanikov. I think he knocks him out. I think
if he does fight Mayweather at a catch weight of 147 and loses that fight, then he doesn't fight at 147 after that fight. Mm-hmm. Then he fights Bradley a third time after the Mayweather fight, remember? So that fight happens at 140. So we're looking at him not stepping up to 147 possibly until Jeff Horn in Australia.
Yeah, but like is that even a thing though? Like
Yeah, no.
Like, they make the Jeff Horn fight based off of because he had a name. There's a guy called Jeff Horn. Like, I don't think Pacquiao goes to 147 unless it's meaningful. Like, you know what I mean? Like I don't think Jeff Horn's even in the picture, to be honest with you. That's just how I feel about it. You know what I mean? I'm gonna stand firm. I think he has a run at 135. I think the Valero fight happens. I think that's a great fight. We're talking about how great of a fight that was. Whether or not the Valero murder suicide happens, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's that. I don't want to go that deep. I don't know if that happens or not. I think the De La Hoya Vernon Forrest fight happens at 154. I think De La Hoya probably fights Margarito 154. A sides him, fights him there. I think he has a trilogy with Mosley, and then he loses a rematch to Mayweather. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, Pacquiao, I think, has a run at 140. I think Haddon's still around a little longer. Then he knocks him out. He probably fights a Malignaggi. I think he gets a Broner fight. Broner and Pacquiao's probably a big pay-per-view fight when Broner was undefeated. Pacquiao's the big name. I think we already kind of know the outcome of that. I think it's a very similar fight. I just think Pacquiao wins. And that's that. I think eventually he has one more crack at 147. And in between all that, he has the Marquez fights, but that's the one thing I don't think changes. He still fights Marquez 4 times.
That definitely doesn't change. And I think he fights Bradley 3 times. That doesn't change. The only thing that changes with that is it's at 140 instead of 147.
And they're the same fights.
Now that I go fight by fight, I think I agree with you. I think it's definitely on under 5 fights. We may be looking at a 2 to 3 fight run at 147. Had the De La Hoya fight never happened. Still a phenomenal career. And still a career that we would have gotten a lot of highlights at 140, possibly at 135. He damages dudes. He just absolutely destroys them in those divisions, runs through it, possibly becomes undisputed. Who knows? But now that I look at the resume, if the De La Hoya fight doesn't happen, and seeing how this plays out piece by piece, a lot of these fights could have happened at 140. Yeah. Some of these fights wouldn't have developed, and the Ricky Hatton fight at 140 would have happened in my mind right around the same time, but I don't think they go right up to 147 to fight Cotto. I just don't. I don't think they go fight Cotto, Clottey, Margarito at 150. I don't think that happens.
I don't think that happens. And I'm not even saying that's like
it's not a bad thing. Like, it's not
it's
a negative thing.
It's still like well, talk at the Valero fight. He still fights Marquez. I think I still think that Broner fight. I still think that Broner fight happens. I really do.
Great fights materialize at 135 and 140 for him. And on top of that, we're talking about a dude who started his career weighing 106.
He's still a Hall of Famer. And he's still he would be still a 7, maybe great. Not 8, but he would be a 7 division champion.
Yeah. Yeah. He goes up to 147 and gets a belt at some point later on in his career. There's no doubt. And he racks up belts at 135 and 140 is what likely happens here.
What's a better run, though?
This one.
The existing one or the hypothetical
one? The existing one's the better run. But it's hard to know, right? Because we don't know who the fights would have been at 135 and 140. That welterweight run he had, though, 18 fights for a dude who started off that low. 18 fights. And the names on this resume. Like, these weren't just dudes. Like, people forget Cotto, Clottey. People didn't want to fight Clottey. People didn't want to fight Margarito. He fought him.
He fought Clottey for sure.
He fought him immediately when he got in the division. He fought Margarito at 150.
He fought Clottey when nobody wanted to fight Clottey because it was such an ugly matchup. Like, you weren't gonna look good. He's tough to beat. Like, all the negatives.
12 rounds too.
Right, and like he still fought him.
The double punch.
Do you remember the bang, bang? And I'll say this. I still remember like Arab trying to sell that fight. Like, it's a better fight than the Mayweather fight. Clottey's gonna bring it. Like, shut up. No, he wasn't. Right, but hey, at the end of the day, I think the moral of the story is Pacquiao still has a great run. Mm-hmm. I think he has some great fights, and there you go. You know,
I agree. If he doesn't fight De La Hoya, great run, great fights at 135 and 140. Under 5 fights at welterweight total, and still all-time great. But I think the existing reality of what happened is better than the one that we're talking about right now. So thank you to Oscar De La Hoya for giving us that fight. Thank you. And thank you for Manny and Freddie for saying we'll take that fight. We'll move up 2 weight classes, because a lot of fighters wouldn't have done that. How often does it happen? A lot of fighters don't do it.
I don't think I still don't think, even a lot of hardcores, I still don't think they understand, like objectively speaking, how amazing that jump was. Like I don't think people grasp it. Like the thought was ridiculous. Like what do you mean? Like you want him to move to, like that was ridiculous. It wasn't a realistic thought. Pacquiao was in a discussion with the Moraleses and the Barreras.
Yeah.
Those are little dudes. Like that's where he was. And once the idea, like once he fought De La Hoya and he beat De La Hoya, like hindsight tells us a lot. I get it. You know, De La Hoya hadn't fought in 7 years. It was a little weight drain. I get it. But that's not the point. I'm talking about perception. I'm talking about like the thought of him even campaign. Like, bro, even when he beat De La Hoya, there was some people saying he ain't gonna stick around. Like you know what I mean? Like, and he stuck around.
Mm-hmm.
He went back down to beat Ricky Hatton, then he jumped back up, and he never looked back. Oh, but he fought Cotto at a catchweight. Like if you're still complaining about that, especially when he never fought at a catchweight ever again after that, like at welterweight anyway.
Yeah.
He fought Claudio 147. He fought everybody else, from the Thurmans to the Rioses, the Bradleys, whoever you want to mention, throw them out there. He fought him at 147.
Yeah.
Like no one, like if you would have told somebody back in 2000, early 2008, when he was going in the ring against David Diaz, this guy's going to move up to 147. And he's going to have a run. Like he's going to have a run. Like he's going to beat a reigning fucking welterweight champion in the year 2020 or 2019 when he beat Thurman, right? People would have said you're stupid.
Mm-hmm.
It's like saying Lomachenko's going to move up to fight Crawford. It's ridiculous. Like that. That's how people thought of it.
I think that's a good comparison to make. Think of Lomachenko moving up to 147. To fight an older guy with a name, and then sticking around the division for 17
and let's say he
fights.
fought like Crawford at a catchweight at 145.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's all people focused on. Oh, but he got him in a catchweight. Like, bro, like dude. Like, you know what I mean? Like that is the level of nitpicking people do with Pacquiao. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that it's not all good point. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not a fan of catchweights, right? But I didn't want the catchweight, and I argued then was because people are going to be bringing it up, and I don't think he needed it. That was my only argument. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the thought of Pacquiao fighting Miguel Cotto 147 was not like a thing. It wasn't a thing back in 2007. It just wasn't. It just wasn't.
Put things in proper perspective. Put them in proper perspective. So incredible run for Pacquiao. And thankfully, Oscar, and thank you to Larry Merchant for putting this out there into the universe.
Threw it out there.
These guys, these 2 dudes picked it up. They made it happen. And the boxing world is better because of it.
What about Navarrete versus, Spence? Why not?
Right.
That's what it sounded like, bro.
I know.
Like Gary Russell Jr. Like, remember when he was going to fight Devin Haney and everybody was saying it was stupid? Like what do you mean he's going to move up? And like that's what it's like. You know what I mean? Like that's what it sounds like, if not worse. Because like, whatever. But I'm just saying, brother. Like, well, Pacquiao's run It's going to be remembered for a long time. And I'll tell you right now, even the hypotheticals we went over, notice how like it's still greatness. Like no matter what road we go in, and like if he would have just stayed at 135, he would have had a historic run.
He had already had a Hall of Fame career up
Oh,
into the David Diaz fight, so
yeah.
it was all icing on the cake at that point, no matter where he went. But
everything he
appreciate the
did,
super chat, by the way, and appreciate Nando for always showing up, man. Appreciate that.
everything he did after the from De La Hoya on was all extra. That's all it was. It was just extra shit.
Yeah, that's quite extra of him to do, right? Like that's a Hall of Fame 18 fight career right there.
Yeah.
So incredible.
And by the way,
he had two or three Hall of Fame careers in one career.
But by the way, let us know what you guys think. How to and again, the only thing we're changing is that the De La Hoya fight doesn't happen, right? How do you think it would have gone? How do you think De La Hoya? We want to know what you guys think. Even the ones right now in the chat, go to the comment section after it's on archive. Let us know. Like, how do you think it would have played out? How do you think it would have happened? You know what I mean? You could be as smart as like haplotype and just like you could do that. You know what I mean? But it's all good. But at the end of the day, what do you think?
What do you think?
It's all conjecture anyway. It's no big deal.
It's fun talk historically. So appreciate y'all for tuning in.
Haplo's still my friend.
Haplo's still our friend. He's still a good guy. He's not a good guy, but he's still our friend. D-Style Boxer. What are we doing tomorrow night? Let us know tomorrow night. What we doing?
Oh, man. Tomorrow, check out the round table. We're going to be on Ringside Reporter. Tune in then.
Tune in. Appreciate y'all dropping by. And like you said, hit those comment sections below if you're watching in the archive. We are out. God bless. Keep it boxing. Peace.